right, so good day to you guys. Hope you guys are all doing well. Like last time, for your assignment for today, put a something significant that happened on this day in history, which would be the 9th of April. Also, pick out one famous birthday for today as well, and put that on your assignment as well. Now, we're going to continue with where we left off, talking primarily about Eisenhower's time as president. We're going to go ahead and finish his time as president today. um, we finished off by talking about Joseph McCarthy, and he was a staunch anti-communist, but the way he went about trying to fight against communism obviously did more harm than good in the long run because he was basically insinuating that a lot of people were communists that were not, and just uh, discredited his own fight against communism as a result, which unfortunately had some negative ramifications for the future as well. Well, in order to understand Eisenhower, I'm going to read a passage from him here in a second, because there were a lot of people who felt like he was unintellectual and just not the smartest guy. Probably because he wasn't one of those guys who graduated from an Ivy League college. Instead, he obviously was a general, which obviously does actually take a lot of intelligence. But people kind of just saw him as someone who didn't really know what he was doing. They couldn't be more wrong, especially when it comes to foreign policy. He was very strong in a lot of areas. So I'm going to read a portion from Eisenhower's writings from his memoir called Crusade in Europe. This has to deal with communism. Communism inspires and enables its militant preachers to exploit injustices and inequity among men. This ideology appeals not to the Italian or Frenchman or South American as such, but to men as human beings who become desperate in an attempt to satisfy common human needs. Therein, it possesses a profound power for expansion. Wherever popular discontent is founded on group oppression or mass poverty or hunger of children, there communism may stage an offensive that arms cannot counter. Discontent can be fanned into revolution, and revolution into social chaos. Um, so basically, he's talking about what is communist dangerous appeal here. Uh, and he really does pinpoint, for the most part, the only areas where communism has ever been tried is where things tended to be going poorly, and people were desperate and looking for answers, so they were willing to turn to communism to try to give them the answer they wanted. Um, really, this is important because what Eisenhower's arguing is that if you can be prosperous, if you can keep your economy going, keep people with jobs, keep people fed, then you can by virtue of having a lot of financial success in your country, basically keep communism out of your country, at least from taking over your country and the people supporting it. Um, this had a big part to play in him refusing to repeal a lot of the New Deal things that have been passed. Um, so we went all the way back to FDR talking about the New Deal. The New Deal started all kinds of things. One of those still going on to this day. You have Social Security and all those things that were begun during the New Deal. And some people wanted him to repeal some of those things, but he refused to do that because he felt it was a good defense against communism and a way to keep freedom going. Um, he was saying, let's let workers earn that new car, buy a television, have a summer cabin by the lake. Because if people have that kind of prosperity, there'll be nothing to fear from the Soviet Union, and nothing to fear from just in general the difficulties that some countries maybe have with communism. So Eisenhower went to Geneva in 1955 to meet the new Soviet communist leaders. There were two men he met there, but it became very clear early on that Nikita Khrushchev was the real leader and the power at the Kremlin, and eventually he would become the unequivocal leader of the Soviet Union. Remember, this is not that long after the death of Stalin. Now, it did seem like this meeting went well and about a brief thaw in the Cold War, but there's going to be things that come up a little bit later today that kind of, once again bring the Cold War up to some strong heights. Eisenhower, after he became president, appointed a new Chief Justice um, to the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, uh, and they moved quickly to issue a racial segregation to issue to respond to the issue, sorry, of racial segregation of schools and basically to desegregate schools. So, in a Supreme Court decision, a landmark case here, Brown versus the Board of Education, by a vote of 9-0, so unanimous, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down racial segregation in public schools, thereby saying you could not segregate in public schools any longer. Now, Eisenhower did not publicly endorse this decision, and he was has been criticized for that. But he felt, and this is his own thoughts on the idea, that by doing so, he was set an undesirable precedent that uh, if he endorsed every decision he agreed with, then he also would have to disagree with the ones he didn't agree with, and he didn't feel like that was the president's job. You got to remember, he's the one who put Earl Warren on the Supreme Court. You got to remember, uh, we'll get to this, but they did a lot to fight for the rights of blacks. This particular Supreme Court did, and a lot of the people who were put here in these positions were by Eisenhower. So he had a big role in breaking down some of the system. Another reason for Eisenhower's restrained response was also his concern to some southern states who might not only try to keep blacks out of the schools. Some of them were threatening to actually shut their public schools down to get all together if they were desegregated. So he's also got to balance the trying to keep the peace across the entire country as much as he can as well. Lead attorney Thurgood Marshall and other leaders of the NAACP fought for this incredible victory. Marshall had counted no more than 4 votes for desegregation on the court when Harry Truman was president. Um, so when Harry Truman was president, Marshall was basically saying if this court case had been tried then, he doesn't feel like there would have been more than 4 votes for the end to segregation in the schools. So quite a change by 1954. Earl Warren deserves a lot of credit in kind of leading the Supreme Court through this, and probably pressuring a few of those that maybe weren't for it to say, hey, we need to be unified in this to end segregation in our country. The very next year, a black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on the city bus. Martin Luther King Jr. immediately protested the arrest of Mrs. Rosa Parks. He said her tax dollars were also spent to run those school buses too, so she deserved a seat on the bus. And he organized a boycott of the bus city lines. He also promised there would be no violence in these fights that he was going to be involved in. He said, I want it to be known throughout Montgomery and throughout this nation that we are a Christian people, and we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness as a mighty stream. I can say this for sure. Martin Luther King Jr. had a way with words, very inspiring speaker. There's a reason people talk about his I Have a Dream speech. Uh, if you read it, the words are pretty incredible, but his delivery is even more incredible. And this is where he begins to become a household name, gets a lot of notoriety on television and in newspapers. One reason Dr. King felt that was so important to emphasize the Christian and constitutional nature of his civil rights fight was that he had been dogged by charges that communists had infiltrated into his team. And for the most part, they had not. However, it does seem that his attorney did have some ties to communism. And that was not something Martin Luther King was aware of, or not why he hired him. But for the most part, it was not at all tied to communism in any way, shape, or form. Interestingly, just like under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance during the time period of Eisenhower, the phrase "In God We Trust" became the official motto of the United States while Eisenhower was president as well. So both those things can be attributed to the time period and the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Martin Luther King emphasized his Christian principles. He returned also again and again to the Declaration of Independence and Constitution as his sources of authority. Really, what I see in Martin Luther King Jr. is a man who is a lot like Frederick Douglass in a lot of ways. There are a few differences, obviously, and the time periods are different. But Frederick Douglass often talked about the Declaration of Independence and Constitution as well in positive terms, not in negative terms, but in positive terms. And Martin Luther King Jr. did the same. Talked about the positive aspects and said we need to live up to what these documents say. Um, well, the Montgomery bus boycott lasted more than a year. Hundreds of volunteers supplied rides to people since they were no longer taking bus transportation. The city appealed to the courts to stop the carpooling. Several black churches, including um, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, who was King's close friend, were firebombed. A white Lutheran pastor who served a black parish had his home bombed by people. Martin Luther King, shaken by the violence, stunned his congregation with this tearful prayer. He said, quote, Lord, I hope no one will have to die as a result of our struggle for freedom. But if anyone but if anyone has to die, let it be me. Uh, Inspiring words, and unfortunately words that would be uh, come true eventually over time. But with the stroke of a pen, the United States Supreme Court had a ruling that declared all segregation on public buses unconstitutional. So now the Supreme Court weighs in here, and now they desegregate buses. And in general, start desegregating the United States, period. I want it to be remembered, a lot of this desegregation takes place under a Republican president, once again, because that's not what you will hear from left-wing media. Everything good happened under Democrats, according to them. Now, I'm not denying some things that were good or didn't happen under Democrats too. I already talked about Truman desegregating the military being a huge move, and that I felt Truman made obviously the right move there. Very positive direction for the United States with that move. And here you have the desegregation of schools, desegregation of buses, and in general, other businesses began to be desegregated. Um, it was really an effort amongst a wide variety of people to bring about segregation during this time period. Like I said, King became the recognizable leader of the civil rights movement as a result of this time period, and would have a voice that would be heard across televisions across America during this time period. Eisenhower invited uh, Dr. Martin Luther King and other leading Black Americans to the Oval Office. It was really the first such meeting since Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington, and that one was the first one since Lincoln had invited Frederick Douglass. So this is really only like the third occasion where a president invites Black leaders. And here, the reason he brought them in was to talk about civil rights and what could be done to maybe bring about more equal America in America where Blacks have equal rights. Now, this next part I don't have on here. I just briefly want to mention it. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, we had that on a test quite a while back. Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, we also had that on a test a while back. They formed into a single union. And one of the things that was common in most countries in the world was that a lot of unions were infiltrated by communists, but the AFL-CIO was actually a bulwark against communism. So it was a labor union fighting for labor rights, but it did avoid going down the path of communism, which was good because if it had become communist, less and less people probably would have supported the work they were doing. Now, the nation was stunned in the autumn of 1955 when they found out President Eisenhower had suffered a serious heart attack. Contrasting what had happened with Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he resolved to give full disclosure and tell everything that happened to cause his problems and his medical condition. Because you say that, remember Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and very few people knew how severe it was, how bad it was. FDR, even though people knew he had polio, he did everything he could to hide that. And then when he's running for his reelection that final time, he did not really disclose how poor his health was at that time. But here we're talking about full disclosure, um, that he wants people to know what is going on. So an openness. Eisenhower, as you come around to the next election in 1956, is looking to run again for reelection. He even considers running with a Democratic governor from Ohio as his vice presidential candidate. He also did that partly because he wanted to be the first to put a Catholic on the ticket to kind of bring some peace between Catholics and Protestants. Um, Obviously, Nixon wasn't on board for that, and in the long run, Nixon still remains on the ballot. The Democrats run Adlai Stevenson again. Eisenhower this time, although some people might still say "I like Ike" as a slogan, really his campaign slogan for 1956 was peace and prosperity, because during his first 4 years in office, America had continued to prosper and had remained at peace. He got America out of the Korean War, and America had not really been involved in any other wars since. Now, obviously, America still got the Soviet Union, the Cold War going on, but it's not an actual war. So peace and prosperity was what he ran on. There's not a whole lot to talk about as far as the election itself goes, meaning it was a pretty easy victory. But we'll get to that because there's a few things that happen in the interim. And good thing is, since he's doing so well as president, it meant this time around he didn't have to campaign as hard. I'm not going to say he didn't campaign, but he has so many other crises to take care of, or at least to deal with. So the campaign, here's two of the foreign crises that happened. Suez Canal, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, okay, and the French forces also gathered together with Israel, and they attack Egypt because Egypt had shut down the Suez Canal. And obviously, this has a huge impact on what is going on in the globe. Eisenhower was very angry about this. He responded and was furious because he had not been consulted by the NATO allies that they were going to do this. And he branded the action of the British and the French and Israel as aggression. This was the first serious split between the United States and Great Britain in quite some time. And for the most part, he actually was right. They should not have done this attack without at least some NATO approval, without consulting Eisenhower and others, not just Eisenhower himself, because this caused a crisis in the Middle East and in Egypt. Eisenhower was hopeful to look towards some other type of way to solve the situation than by attacking Egypt and the Suez Canal. In Hungary, workers joined in a revolt just before 1956 presidential election, trying to wrench their freedom from the Soviet sphere. While it seemed to be working at first, because a more liberal regime under communists were installed. Liberal here is not the phrase you probably think of. This means a more one that would be more open to individual rights. Was installed. However, the Soviet Union rolled in tens of thousands, rolled in tanks, and tens of thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters crushed. Khrushchev was now the Soviet dictator. He blamed Western agitation for this revolt. And although that's not 100% true, because I mean, the United States government did not back this in any way, shape, or form, it's partially true because the United States did have radio broadcasts. One was called Voice of America, going out talking about freedom, which did lead some people in Eastern Europe to desire to find their own freedom. Now, some people thought negatively towards Eisenhower because he did not intervene in this situation, and he failed to, what they would say, roll back the Iron Curtain. But once again, he's doing the idea of containment. He's not trying to take over areas that the Soviets haven't had control of. He's just trying to keep it growing. So interestingly, it turns out that some of this was going on because Emperor not emperor, I guess I should say, but Chairman Mao of China had actually, it turns out, pressured Khrushchev into fighting in Hungary because early on, this Hungarian freedom fighters seemed like they might win, but it's from what we know now, seems like Chairman Mao pressured Khrushchev to take this action, sending in the tanks, crushing the revolt in Hungary. And this is important because Khrushchev is not a lot like Stalin. Not that Khrushchev's a great guy. He's not like, wow, he's a good guy. But Khrushchev was not someone that uh, killed tens of millions of people. That's just not something he did. Whereas Mao was a lot like Stalin. In fact, he looked up Stalin's leadership style. Um, so, like to get the agrarian reforms, which means agricultural reforms, Stalin had killed 7 million Russians. Emperor Chairman Mao, sorry, I keep wanting to call him Emperor for some reason. Chairman Mao himself killed an estimated 40 million Chinese to get his agrarian reforms. Okay, so he was a much harsher dictator than Khrushchev was. Okay, like I said, Eisenhower was reelected in a landslide, 457 electoral votes to 73 electoral votes. He won by about 10 million, not quite, but almost 10 million popular votes, which equaled about 16% more of the popular vote. So we're talking about a huge landslide. In fact, up to this point in time in history, this was the greatest victory by a Republican, most one-sided victory by a Republican. However, this is something we talked about last year in government class, that oftentimes if there's a popular candidate running for office, and they do well in election, then their political party wins a lot of the things. So you would think with Eisenhower having such a strong showing that the Republicans then would sweep in and take over Congress, but that was not the case. There was no coattail effect this time. Eisenhower wins big, but Democrats are able to continue to control the House of Representatives and the Senate. So there was no coattail effect. It's just that he was that popular amongst everybody and seen that way. Really, Eisenhower's greatest domestic achievement is the interstate highway system. Now, as early as 1920, he had led an Army truck convoy on a 2-month expedition across the United States. And part of it was that, it didn't technically take 2 months to drive across the United States at this point in time. There were some roads, obviously, but still, they were, doing some PR driving across country, but the driving was slow. The roads were very poor. Also, being the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, he did see the advantages that Hitler had brought to Germany because of the Autobahn. So the Autobahn was a great road system, and it allowed Germans to move their troops from one side of their country to the other. So Eisenhower begins 40,000 miles of interstate highways, the largest public works project in history. Still, it's the largest public works project, and it really changed America forever. America loves their cars, and that's because we got lots of good roads that we can drive those on. And this is really thanks to Eisenhower. Now, in 1957, a locally elected school board in Little Rock, Arkansas, voted to comply with the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. They began to desegregate schools. Slowly in 1957, 9 Black students were registered for classes at the Central High School there. Some whites did protest, and then Democratic Governor Orville Faubus called out the Arkansas National Guard to block the Black students from registering and from going to their classes. Eisenhower ordered the Justice Department to go into federal court to demand the governor withdraw his state's troops. Faubus did give in, but riots by white protesters broke out as the Black students began their classes. Quickly, Eisenhower sent the 104th Airborne Division to protect the Black students and enforce the law. The 104th Airborne Division stayed at the school actually for several months to ensure order. So it wasn't something that was fixed in a short amount of time, but it took a while. Interestingly, behind the scenes, Eisenhower also knew that the Little Rock was being exploited by Soviet propaganda, trying to show that America is segregated, which it had been. And that was seen very poorly by other international communities. Ironically, a couple of people who condemned Eisenhower's use of force, sending in the 104th Airborne to try to desegregate the school, were John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnston. Okay, now Little Rock obviously was a big news story, but it was knocked off the front pages by something that stunned the world, and that was Sputnik, which was the first satellite to be shot into outer space. It obviously was put up there by the Soviet Union. Americans began to fear that the Soviet Union was spying on them, that they could launch nuclear missiles from this. And eventually, you might have that as a capability from something up in space. So Americans began to have a concern more than they had had before. Also, a reporter asked Eisenhower if the launch of Sputnik didn't prove the superiority over communism over capitalism. After all, he said Khrushchev was boasting that the hammer and sickle flag was flying on the moon. Eisenhower responded by saying, "I think it's crazy. We should not be hysterical when dictatorships do these things." So Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." And he was talking about this advancement into the space race. Joseph Stalin had kind of started this, and Khrushchev finished their space program here to get this launched into space. But the USSR had done this in secret. Khrushchev used this to basically state that the winds of change were that socialism was now the way to go, and that communism was the way to see these things happen. In fact, Khrushchev, to some people, had even said that they eventually would outstrip the United States economy, that this was just the first step in the rise of communism to prove that it is more powerful in every way than capitalism and the United States. Now, Khrushchev, one of the things about him that's very different than Stalin is Stalin was more brutal. We talked about that already. But Stalin tended to stay inside, tended not to go out and give a lot of speeches, tended not to be really, in your face, tended to stay more reserved and to himself. Whereas Khrushchev was a much louder person, a person who had a sense of humor, highly intelligent, had a charm to him. He wasn't a particularly attractive person. He was bald, had lots of warts, 52-inch waistline. That's a big waist. But he moved around really well for a man his size. Most Americans didn't even know they were in a space race. So this was something that they were unaware of because, like I said, the Soviets launched this in secret. America then decided they would invite the world to watch them build their own space program and send their own satellite into space. Now, this does have some disastrous consequences to American prestige at first, as America's filming and rockets take off and explode on the launch pad, don't get far off the ground and explode. So for a while, America looks pretty weak. America looks like they are behind in this particular issue. Many people, Senator Kennedy, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Republican, but one who wasn't very happy, talked about the missile gap that the United States had with the Soviet Union and became concerned. Eisenhower knew this was untrue. He had launched a new program in 1955 of U-2 spy planes. These planes would fly like 70,000 feet up in the air, and they would take pictures. And he knew had a pretty good idea too, because of the technology and the just the information we had on the Soviet Union, that America was not behind as far as missiles go. Obviously, at this point in time, America was behind in the space race. They also didn't take into account that the United States was the first to develop a nuclear-powered submarine, which went all the way under the polar ice cap. So finally, they had discovered that Northwest Passage. You just had to go under the ice. So obviously, that's why they couldn't do it earlier. But this was the USS Nautilus, a huge advancement in technology, which showed the superiority in this area for the United States. Well, Eisenhower's new look defense had increased Americans' reliance on nuclear weapons. And one of the things Eisenhower, too, used a lot was the CIA to destabilize left wing regimes. So this happens in Iran, it happens in Guatemala during this time period, where communists were attempting to take over those countries, and through destabilization because of the CIA, so not having to actually fight a war, they were able to destabilize those and keep those countries from becoming communist. Um, Now, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union did shoot down a U-2 spy pilot days before a East-West summit was to take place in 1960. Eisenhower issued a cover story saying that Francis Gary Powers was actually a weather reconnaissance flight that had been blown off course. Khrushchev then let the world be known that the pilot had been taken alive and had confessed to spying. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to watch the movie Bridge of Spies. I just don't know how I can get it to you guys to all watch it, and I don't know if it's even on things like Netflix or anything like that. I'm not going to expect you guys to all go do that. But it deals partly with Francis Gary Powers. He's not the main character, but the rescue of Francis Gary Powers in a trade for another spy, a Soviet spy that was found in the United States. But I just want to say this: Francis Gary Powers was not supposed to let himself be taken alive. What he was doing was so top secret that they literally said, if your plane's shot down and you realize and you're gonna die and you're gonna land in the Soviet Union, you're supposed to kill yourself. The thing is, he did lose the thing that he was supposed to in the air that he was supposed to kill himself with. But it was that top secret, that big a deal. So it was a pretty big deal that he was taken captive. And Eisenhower here was actually caught in a lie. Obviously, Khrushchev demanded I apologize as a condition for actually continuing to go to the summit in Paris in 1960 before he would attend. Eisenhower refused to apologize for his lie. Obviously, you're trying to maintain a particular image as president, and this would be the same thing that the Soviet Union would do. You would not automatically say this guy's a spy. That's not something you would want to do. In fact, Eisenhower was supported by Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was France's President Charles de Gaulle, and West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. And all the Democratic leaders in NATO were firmly behind Eisenhower and his decision not to apologize. However, Senator John F. Kennedy suggested that Eisenhower should apologize for the sake of peace. Interestingly, once Kennedy becomes president, he becomes more like Eisenhower and understands as a president, you just can't take that step. You can't give in to that. It's during this time period, too, you had the rise of television, and this is where people would be getting a lot of their news. TV was announced by the Federal Communications Commissioner Newton Minow as a vast wasteland. He's just saying there was a lot of immorality on TV. Comedian Fred Allen called television bubblegum for the eyes. And that vast wasteland part is pretty funny to me because if you've ever seen shows from the 1950s, which I bet a lot of you have not, honestly, I haven't seen that many from the 50s. And I've seen a lot of shows from like the 60s and 70s. But even the shows from the 60s, 70s, even for the most part, I'm not going to say all of them, but for the most part, man, there's hardly a show on TV that is as clean as those shows. Meaning that they're back then, I think of I Love Lucy, which was more of a 60s show, but still a similar concept. That on that TV show, it's about a married couple. And the funny thing is, they actually were a true married couple. In real life, they were married. Yet in the TV show, they slept in separate beds. They were still sleeping in separate beds, I think, in the Dick Van Dyke Show, too. I'm just saying it's interesting that it's like, and maybe the Dick Van Dyke Show wasn't, but it's still Interesting that we've come so far that back then they thought that was bad. Oh man, I can guarantee you right now, if Newton Minow watched TV today, he would be appalled at the wasteland TV has become. And I sit here saying that, and I've watched some of those shows, unfortunately, but it is a totally different thing today. That's for sure. You also had Ed Sullivan. He had people on like Elvis Presley during this time period. This is not the Beatles yet. That's not till a little bit later on. But he also had on opera singers. He had on a mime named Marcel Marot. Imagine you're watching television and someone's variety act is there a mime. Oh, that would be fun to watch. Also, TV was a little bit different back then. Advertisements weren't, you didn't really have commercial breaks. That comes a little bit later, but the 1950s, you would have a weekly announcement of a company that would be sponsoring the shows. One of those was GE Theater. And the spokesperson for this was Ronald Reagan. Like he would get on and talk about GE and advertise for them, and then they would go do their shows. Obviously, the TV is what allows Martin Luther King Jr.'s message to be spread so quickly as well. So, how can we sum up Eisenhower's time as president? He filled the benches of the federal judiciary. So, this isn't just the Supreme Court, but federal judgeships across the United States with people who were fiercely against segregation. So, Eisenhower plays a big part in making the courts responsible for bringing down segregation. Henry Wallace, if you guys remember, man, he was the guy that was on the verge of a communist at one point in time. He reforms later in life, but he had been a vice president to FDR, and he compared Eisenhower to George Washington. Now, not because he's the father of our country, but in that people from both political parties like Eisenhower. Eisenhower was someone who just brought people together. He wasn't a true Republican. He wasn't a true Democrat. He just did what he thought was right. And he was able to bring people together instead of cause division. Maybe that's the kind of person we need today. He eventually went and retired to a home living near Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. This last year was the first time, but we went up in a tower in Gettysburg. There at the battlefield site, we were able to see his house off in the distance. Let me end this by saying this. A writer sums up Eisenhower like this. He was so comforting, so grandfatherly, so calm, so sure of himself, so skillful in managing the economy, so experienced in ensuring America's defense, so expert in his control of the intelligence community, so knowledgeable about the world affairs, so nonpartisan and objective in those above the battle posture, so insistent on holding to the middle of the road that he inspired a trust that was as broad and as deep as any president since George Washington. So once again, another person comparing him to George Washington. Now, before you go, I do have one last question I want you to answer on your assignment that is due today. It's pretty simple. Once again, this is one you can't get wrong. Might be a little harder to answer than your favorite color, though. So I want you to tell me, what is your favorite movie? You can only choose one movie, and so don't do 3 or 4 movies. You have to figure it out. What is your favorite movie of all time? So that's it for today. Hope you guys are doing well. We will see you once again next week.